Hey everyone, it's the Chess Playing Pediatrician. A few days ago I played a game with one of my friends and I made a blunder pretty early in the game. And luckily he didn't notice that and made a mistake of his own, and I was able to take advantage of that and wriggle out of a tight situation and eventually come back and win the game. So I'm going to walk you through that game, but first I would like to talk about a checkmating pattern called the tailmate. There are two types of tailmates. They're called a swallowtail mate and a dovetail mate. So before I walk through this game that I mentioned earlier, I just want to give a quick tutorial on both of these mating patterns. Okay, so the first variation of the tailmate is called the swallowtail mate. So for this checkmate, there are two requirements. The first one is that your opponent's king has to be flanked on two adjacent corners by his own pieces. So we see here, we have the opponent's king, and he's flanked on these two corners by his pawn and his rook. The second requirement is that there has to be a square horizontal to your opponent's king that isn't attacked by any of your opponent's pieces, and that is being attacked by your queen and by one of your other pieces. So what you're going to do on this checkmate pattern is you're just going to move your queen to that square right there, and that's going to be checkmate. You see the king can't take the queen because she's protected by her bishop. And then the king also can't move out of check because he is flanked on these two corners by his own pieces, so he can't move diagonally. The second variation of a tailmate is called a dovetail mate. For this checkmate, your opponent's king is going to be flanked on two adjacent sides by his own pieces. So in this case, we have our opponent's king here, and he's flanked on two adjacent sides by a pawn and another pawn. And for this checkmate, you're going to be attacking the king diagonally instead of horizontally. So we're going to be moving to this square right here with our queen. We see we have our queen who is aiming at the square and is also protected by her rook. So for this checkmate pattern, we're just going to move to that F1 square diagonal to the king, like that. And again, you see this is checkmate because the king can't attack the queen because she's protected by the rook, and the king isn't able to move out of checkmate because he's flanked on these two adjacent sides by his own pawns. So for this game, as I mentioned earlier, I made a mistake early on in the game, which should have cost me the game. Fortunately for me, my opponent didn't realize that and made a mistake of his own, and this allowed me to eventually regain the advantage and come back and win the game. So for this game, I'm playing black. My opponent starts the game by moving his king's pawn up one square to E3. I respond by moving my queen's pawn up two squares to D5. He then moves with his bishop on king's side. I respond with my C column pawn. And then he attacks my queen side pawn with his pawn there. I defend my queen's pawn with my king's pawn. He develops his knight. I develop my knight. He moves his king's rook's pawn to H4. I move my bishop, my king's bishop, up to D6 there. And at this point, my plan is to castle on king's side. And I'm going to show you in a minute why that ended up not being a good idea. So then he advances his knight to attack my H7 and F7 squares. I respond with my knight, and he responds with his queen. And again, this is where I made my big mistake of the game. So I continued with my original plan, and I castled king's side. And now I'm going to move to my analysis board to show you why that was a bad idea and how my opponent should have responded. So after I castle king's side, he responds by taking my H7 pawn with his bishop. And you see, this puts me in a really bad situation. There's only two ways that I can get out of check. I can either move my king over one square to the left to h8, or I can attack his bishop with my knight there. So I decide to to capture his bishop with my knight. And this I kind of felt was the best situation because, at least I'm in a bad situation, but at least I'm one piece up. And then the way he should have responded here was to move his queen to my h5 square there. And if he had done that, I don't think there's any way that he would not have won the game. Just to kind of look at a couple ways that this situation could have played out had he moved his queen there. Let's say I attacked his queen with my pawn. He just moves his queen and captures my knight, and it's checkmate right there. Another possibility, say I attack his knight with my knight. He just takes my knight with his pawn, and then, again, not really anything I can do to avoid checkmate. I guess the only thing that I could do is I could move my rook to give my king space to move, and then if he would have tried to have done that, I could have moved my king there. But then again, that still puts me in a very unfavorable situation where I don't think I could have won. A couple other situations that could have played out here. So let's say I let's say I'm just trying to move my rook out of the way to give my king space to move. Then he could attack this f7 pawn there, and then again, checkmate. And let's see other things I could have done. If I had taken his knight with my queen, he would have taken my queen with his pawn. And then, again, not really anything I could have done to avoid checkmate. Okay, so now we'll go back to this position here to show you how the game actually played out. So instead of moving his queen to h5 there, like I believe he should have done, he decided to threaten this knight here with his pawn by taking my pawn. And at this point, I had to make a decision. My first kind of instinct here was to move my knight out of harm's way, so that I could stay up a piece and at least have an advantage with as far as number of pieces. But then I realized, again, that if he was able to get his queen here to h5, I would have been in big trouble. So my decision was to sacrifice my knight and move my g7 pawn up to g6. That way I was protecting that square so that he wasn't able to get his queen there. And so he responds by taking my knight with his pawn. I respond by taking his pawn with my pawn. And then this is the move that he made that I believed ultimately cost him the game. He then took my pawn with his queen, threatening my rook. And then from here, I was able to just move my rook out of the way. He responds by reinforcing his knight with his pawn. I respond by threatening his queen. He moves his queen out of the way, and I then threaten his rook with my bishop. And I don't know if you can see here, so at this point I have this entire diagonal length of the board covered with this bishop. I've pretty much locked his queen all the way over on this side of the board, away from where his offensive was on the left side of the board. So by doing this, by shutting off this entire half of the board to his queen, I had essentially dismantled his offensive. So at this point, he moves his rook out of the way and tries to threaten my bishop. I threaten his queen with my rook. He takes my pawn with his queen. And then I threatened his queen with my queen, essentially offering to trade queens. So at this point, I really thought that he was going to take my queen, but then he moves his queen to d7 to move his queen out of harm's way. And then at this point, again, his queen is kind of just blocked off to this entire left side of the board. You know, she can't really go anywhere to get back to this left side of the board, which is where my king is. So then I respond, sorry, that was kind of fast. I respond by taking his knight with my knight. And then he responds by taking my knight with his pawn. I then am able to get my queen all the way over here to the left side of the board where his king is relatively unprotected. So then he takes my bishop with his rook. I take his rook with my queen. He takes my bishop with his queen. I then put his king in check with my queen. He then moves his king out of the way. I take his bishop with my queen. He moves his queen to e5, probably attempting to have an access route to this side of the board, but at that point it was too late. I took his pawn with my rook. We see here that my rook is protected by my queen. He moves his pawn up to a4. I take his knight with my rook. And then we had just gone over two different tail checkmate variations, and you'll see I finished the game with a dovetail mate. You see the king is flanked on two adjacent sides by two of his own pieces, and then I check his king over here diagonal to that, and his king doesn't have anywhere to go. It is checkmate. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that game. I hope you also were able to get something from my tutorials on the two variations of a tailmate, the swallow tailmate and the dovetail mate. Thank you so much for watching my videos. Please like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already.